Every year, at its annual conference, the Society of Catholic Scientists presents an award named after St. Albert the Great, the patron saint of natural scientists. And we present it to a Catholic scientist whose life and work are a witness to the harmony of faith and science, harmony between the vocation of scientists and the life of faith. The witness recognized by the award may be given in various ways, including distinguished achievements in scientific research by a scientist who is a faithful Catholic, or in writing that illuminates the relationship of science and faith, or service to the scientific community, or to society, or to the church. The board of SCS decided to confer this year's St. Albert Award to Professor Lawrence M. Principe, who is, we are proud to say, a member of SCS and has been for years. Lawrence M. Principe received his Ph.D. in organic chemistry from Indiana University and his Ph.D. in the history of science from Johns Hopkins University. He is the Drew Professor of the Humanities at Johns Hopkins University and professor in both the Department of the History of Science and Technology and the Department of Chemistry. He is also director of the Charles Singleton Center for the Study of Pre-Modern Europe. He has written or edited 11 books, I may be wrong, but that's what I counted, and published numerous scholarly papers. His main studies concern the early history of chemistry, and he is recognized as one of the foremost experts on the history of alchemy. He was the first recipient of the Francis Bacon Award by the California Institute of Technology for significant contributions to the history of science. His book, Alchemy Tried in the Fire, Starkey, Boyle, and the Fate of Helmontian Chemistry, was awarded the Pfizer Award by the History of Science Society in 2005. In 2016, he received the Franklin Lavoisier Prize in Paris from the Fondation de la Maison de la Chimie and the Chemical Heritage Foundation. Professor Principe has written and lectured widely on the historical relationship between science and religion. No one has done more to dispel the widely held myth of perennial science-religion warfare. In particular, of particular note is his 12-lecture audio course entitled Science and Religion, which he recorded for the Great Courses series of the Teaching Company in 2006. These lectures treat their subject with the comprehensiveness, depth, balance, and accuracy that only a great scholar could achieve, but at the same time, the lectures are broadly accessible, lucid, and entertaining. There's nothing to compare with them, and they're an indispensable resource for any person interested in the real history of the relation between science and religion. I'll now present the plaque that we customarily give to Professor Principe, immediately after which he will give his lecture entitled Scientific Innovation and Franciscan Spirituality in the Middle Ages. So, Professor Principe.
Well, before I begin my talk, let me just express my thanks for this wonderful award. I'm very honored to receive it, very honored to be here and to address all of you. So thank you so much. And it's been a great pleasure, made even more great a pleasure to be here talking with you after having been starved for intellectual companionship person to person for the past 18 months, and I think so many of us feel that way at this point. It's just been such a marvelous opportunity for me to be here now and to receive this award, so thank you very much. So I think one of the ways I was going to begin was to say, well, now for something completely different, because my talk will be different from most of the talks, except for the most recent one we heard, in that it's about the past and it's about Earth. I'm going to talk about the work done by a large number of one particular religious order, namely the Franciscans in the Middle Ages. So enough Franciscans were involved in scientific pursuits to allow historians to speak of a distinctly Franciscan science that's characterized by particular topics, methods, and outlooks. One thing I should have also said at the beginning about being different, because I was a scientist first and now I'm a humanist, or I'm both at the same time, I realized that maybe scientists aren't so used to the fact that humanists, we tend to read our papers. I'll try not to make it boring. I'll look at you occasionally. Right. So I hope to tell you some interesting things about Franciscan science of the Middle Ages. I think we are still very far, all of us are still very far from an adequate appreciation of medieval thought. The adjective medieval is often tossed around as a term of contempt, which it certainly should not be, but this is the result of 500 years of anti-medieval rhetoric, first by Renaissance humanists, then by Protestant polemicists, 18th century philosophers, and again in lots of ignorant internet babble. And I also think that as Catholics, we have a particular responsibility to understand the Middle Ages better, because in fact the terms medieval and Catholic are often linked in many people's minds, and the opprobrium launched at one affects the other. So now I also have to make a little confession here that I'm making this task of talking about the importance of the Middle Ages a little bit more difficult for myself, because one of the sciences I'm going to talk about a lot is alchemy, a subject that has also been widely misunderstood and vilified. So I'm going to give you a few examples of some medieval Franciscan alchemy, but I can't talk too much about it. I will just now shamelessly promote my book, The Secrets of Alchemy, if you'd like to know a little bit more about that. So what I also hope to do today is to expand some of the conversation about science and religion generally. We're all familiar with really valuable efforts to undermine the warfare or conflict metaphor, which has been called the myth that wouldn't die, or to refute the notion of Catholicism's opposition to science by enumerating lists of Catholic scientists. And this is a great thing. It's an important thing to do that people just don't know about this. But I think it also has a few places in which it doesn't go quite far enough. The first problem is that critics can read it as a merely negative argument, namely, religion didn't impede these particular individuals. They might be unusual in that regard. Second, lists like that can sometimes, if they're not careful, take thinkers out of context so we don't also appreciate their motivations behind things. And finally, I think most of all, because scientific discoveries and ideas tend to be modified or overturned by succeeding generations, critics may try to deny the relevance of earlier investigators on the grounds that their specific discoveries turned out to be incorrect from a present-day perspective. Now, this is really, particularly to a historian, a silly response, but also to scientists, because as any honest researcher knows, the scientific enterprise is a process. The first steps of an investigation, whether or not they are later overturned, are absolutely as important in the process as the most recent ones. And this observation argues that scientific culture, by which I mean a mindset that is both interested in exploring the mysteries of the world and believes that such exploration is meaningful and important, is ultimately a more valuable, a more important thing than the actual content of science at any given moment in time, past or present. So the consequence is, while it is extremely important to remember the many foundations and continuing scientific discoveries made by religious individuals, it is more important, although more difficult, to reveal how specific religious ideas, commitments, and environments have encouraged the development of scientific culture. So, therefore, after I have described some remarkable medieval Franciscans, I will try to identify some features of specifically Franciscan theology and spirituality that I believe encouraged these friars to study the natural world. Now, some of these features go back to St. Francis himself, who, just to remind you, established the Order of Friars Minor in 1209. Some of them come from more developed theological meditations, although St. Francis did not want his friars to become professors of theology, a great many did exactly that. And the first of these was Alexander of Hales, an eminent theologian at Paris, who took the Franciscan habit in 1236 and kept his professorial chair at the same time. Now, I've looked around for images of Alexander of Hales, and I'm going to show you the one that I was thrilled to find in a little tiny Umbrian town. I just love this one. There he is. This is on the padella, that is the bottom rank of a triptych. And on that padella, it had various Franciscan thinkers, none of them sainted, by the way, but all of them intellectuals. And I love him trying to look through his medieval spectacles to read the book. And sometimes I feel very much like him. I wish I had a student that would take the book a little bit further away so that I could focus on it better. Alexander's student, St. Bonaventure, became Minister General of the order in 1265 and encouraged intellectual activity by both example and action, so that by 1300, the two new mendicant orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, had become the major intellectual forces at universities. Now, in order to illustrate this to you, you get to see my vacation pictures here, okay? This was on a different vacation in a Franciscan church in Bolzano. And this was one of the more remarkable things I've ever seen. Here, the walls are not dedicated with saints or biblical figures. These are the Franciscan professors here on the church walls. And you can see that they are doing what all professors are supposed to be doing. They're arguing with one another. Now, personally, I rather think that it would be a good idea to have more church walls decorated with professors. It would remind congregants of the immense intellectual traditions of Catholicism, and I think would be an improvement over some of the sort of saccharine or rather dyspeptic figures of saints that I've seen in some less artistically gifted churches. So here is one more of them. There's Alexander of Hales again, third from the end. Well, probably the only medieval Franciscan I'll mention today with any name recognition is Roger Bacon, known as the Doctor Mirabilis, the marvelous doctor. He was born around 1220, spent most of his life at the universities of Paris and Oxford, became a Franciscan around 1256. While at Paris, he became a colleague, and I'm a little ashamed to say this after taking this award, he became a colleague and a critic of St. Albert the Great. But he also became a friend to Guy de Fulk, the Bishop of Narbonne, who in 1265 was elected Pope Clement IV. Now, Clement asked Bacon to write him some books with the ideas that he had heard Bacon expounding in Paris. And Bacon set to it and sent the Pope at least 3 books, probably more than that. These books proposed a far-reaching reform of education. Bacon argued that the universities of his day spent too much time on logic and disputation. This is one of the arguments he had with Albert. And that university education should be recentered around languages, mathematics, medical reform, alchemy, and especially scientia experimentalis. Now, it would be very easy to define that, sort of misdefine it, as experimental science, but it's better to render it as knowledge gained by experience. And Bacon also intends it to mean applications of the knowledge that's been gained. So, For Bacon, Scientia Experimentalis is a part of the way to investigate the world. And here a quote from him: "In the first place, there should be a willingness to believe, until in the second place experiment follows, so that in the third place reasoning can be applied." His interest was to put this experience in there in between the belief and the application of reason, which is why he was not thrilled with an emphasis on syllogistic reasoning alone. He uses the example of magnetism. If you'd never seen a magnet attract iron, you would dismiss it as some kind of fanciful account that had no credibility. But if you first posit a belief in the reports you hear about it, then you would get yourself a magnet and some iron, and you would do experiments and learn about it experimentally, and then you would apply reason to what you had seen to learn something about the magnet. Now, notice that one of the interesting things here is that Bacon's process responds to St. Augustine's paradox of whether one believes in order to understand or understands in order to believe. And Bacon, at least for scientific purposes, comes down on the side of the belief comes first. Well, Bacon received a lot of reports that he had to either believe or not believe because he was part of a far-flung Franciscan network of missionaries made possible by the unified constitution of the mendicant orders. He was the first European to mention, and I quote from him again, one of the things he sent to the Pope, "A powder made of saltpeter, sulfur, and willow charcoal, which, enclosed in a piece of parchment the size of a finger, makes so much sound that it greatly hurts the ears of men, and likewise a terrible lightning flash." True to his interest in applications, he adds, "If indeed we were to make it in a great quantity, nothing would be able to withstand it." Well, this report of gunpowder was very probably brought to him by his fellow Franciscan, Willem van Rosbrück, who had been on a mission to the Mongol Khan in 1253 and 54. This is Willem's report to the King of France, and there is Willem and his companion on the bottom setting out for Mongolia and China. The Franciscans quickly created an extended information network through far-flung friaries, and it really surprises most people to learn, it surprised me when I first learned it, that there were 8 Catholic bishops in dioceses in East Asia, all Franciscans, including an Archbishop of Peking by 1307. Well, Bacon's insistence on Scientia Experimentalis includes practical application, and it comes out clearly when he writes, quote, "All other sciences are subject to it, as shipbuilding is to navigation." Now, what on earth does that mean? Well, what I think he means is that the knowledge of how to build a ship must be subject to the practical needs of navigation. The practical purpose of a ship must determine how the builders build it. So he's using this applicability, this application, this technological knowledge as a way to govern the information of the sciences. It's often said that medieval sciences were predominantly speculative rather than practical, and this is true to an extent, but particularly among the Franciscans, practical application had an unusually high status. And I'll give you one more example of Bacon's need for application. A rather long quotation here. "A geometer knows how to make an oval figure, such that all incident lines coming to it are reflected to a single point. But the geometer does not know what a mirror made in this shape is useful for. The experimenter, however, knows how to use it to melt all metals, to calcine all stones, and even to destroy every army, camp, and whatever he wishes, not just nearby, but at whatever distance he wishes." So, now, if making gunpowder bombs and parabolic mirror death rays doesn't quite sound like St. Francis's path of universal love, one has to understand that in Bacon's day, Christianity faced a terrifying threat. The Mongols had breached the borders of Poland and sent a demand to the Pope for his capitulation. If the Franciscan missionary effort to them failed, Europe needed a means to repel them, and so Bacon was advocating for Pope Clement IV a technological defense program for the Church based on mathematics and Scientia Experimentalis. And additionally, many Franciscans at the time, including Bacon, were motivated by recent apocalyptic prophecies about the arrival of an Antichrist from the East that would try to exterminate Christianity. And for many, the Mongols fit that description a little too well. But Bacon's practical applications were not all warlike. He also advocated a reform of medicine, and here too, Scientia Experimentalis was his method. Experiments made on inanimate bodies can be repeated many times until all faults and errors are cast out. One cannot arrive at truth except by means of experiment. Medicine's errors were due, he says, to a neglect of alchemy. And Bacon defines alchemy as, this is his definition, the science that speculates about all inanimate objects, all inanimate substances, and the generation of all things from the elements. It teaches how to make more noble metals, pigments, and many other substances better and more plentifully than they are made by nature. And as a synthetic organic chemist, that last line is exactly it. Better and more plentifully than they are made by nature. Alchemy is also for him the science of elements, stones, of gold and other metals, sulfurs, salts, vitriols, flammable bitumens, oils, and, says he, of an infinite number of other things about which we have nothing in the books of Aristotle. So, thus for Bacon and his contemporaries, and St. Albert, by the way, gives a similar definition of alchemy, it is the study of material substances, their transformations and composition, their productions, and their uses. So I emphasize this point to contradict a common error that medieval alchemy was something magical or spiritual or fraudulent, and it was really none of those things. There's what they're talking about in the Middle Ages about alchemy. So alchemy, as the most practical and productive of the sciences, as is chemistry today, was central to Franciscan science. One of Francis's own companions, Elias of Cortona, whom Francis chose as his successor, reportedly practiced alchemy and was reportedly deposed, well, he was deposed in 1239, reportedly due to his over-interest in alchemical processes rather than running the order. And our evidence for this is quite slim, but there are manuscripts of alchemical processes that circulated under his name. In the 1260s, Bonaventura da Iseo, another provincial of the order, and a friend of St. Albert and St. Thomas, wrote an encyclopedic treatment of alchemy in which he endeavored to bring together the alchemical ideas of Bacon and Albert. Indeed, what St. Albert and St. Thomas wrote about alchemy was very probably informed by their conversations. They knew Bonaventura of Iseo quite well, but probably those conversations probably informed them. So many Franciscans were involved in alchemy that in my searches for medieval manuscripts, I often come across entire compendia that are nothing but alchemical treatises, all by Franciscans. So something's going on there. One of the most substantial texts of Franciscan alchemy came from an Italian, Paul of Taranto, who was a lecturer in the school at Assisi in the second half of the 13th century. He wrote a book called Theory and Practice, and is very probably the author of one of the most influential medieval treatises on alchemy, the Summa Perfectionis. And you can see that in its title, Summa, it was meant as a textbook, and may have been used perhaps in the Franciscan school at Assisi. It was influential, highly influential, down to the end of the 17th century. Like, wow, a textbook that you can use for 400 years? My students can't even use theirs for 18 months before a new edition comes out. So what the Summa describes is how to carry out laboratory operations like distillation, sublimation, crystallization, refining operations like cupellation and quartation. It lists the properties and reactivities of metals, salts, and other materials. But I think the most striking part about it is its theoretical content. Its explanations of material transformation deploy a coherent matter theory based on submicroscopic particles They're coming together and they're falling apart. The unseen combinations of these particles explain universally chemical changes and properties like reactivity, density, volatility. Gold, he says, for example, is composed of extremely small particles tightly pressed together, and so it's a very dense metal. Tin, on the other hand, is made out of larger particles, not as much pressed together. It's got more empty space in it, and so it's less dense. Likewise, gold resists a fire because its components are tightly connected one to the other, whereas tin and lead are calcined in a fire into a dusty material. The fire breaks them apart. So this is a very interesting, comprehensive, what he's struggling for is some kind of universal theory to explain the vast variety of chemical observations and phenomena. Well, this system, by the way, predates the rediscovery of Lucretius's De Rerum Natura by 150 years, and the broader revival of ancient atomism in the 17th century by 300 years. And in fact, the work of one of my colleagues, William Newman, has shown that many early atomists of the scientific revolution did not get their idea from ancient Greeks like Democritus, Epicurus, and Lucretius, but rather from the continuing traditions of medieval alchemy that were begun in the Summa Perfectionis. It's a very, very influential text. Well, one of the most remarkable Franciscan alchemists that I want to talk about is someone I'm working on right now, is John of Rupescissa, or Jean de Roquetaillade, who had a remarkable, if rather unpleasant life. He was born around 1310 near Aurillac in south-central France. In 1326, he began his studies at the University of Toulouse, and he joined the Franciscans in 1332. He then continued his studies in Franciscan studia for another 5 years. Then, the event that really changed his life. At the friary in Aurillac, on the 8th of September in 1340, while chanting Te Deum Laudamus, John had a sudden prophetic insight. The Antichrist would appear in mid-1366. After grave persecutions lasting 3.5 years, Antichrist would be destroyed by divine providence, and a restorer would usher in a 1,000-year era of peace before the end of time. And John then began on his career of preparing the church for this eventuality. Due to his prophecies and also his embrace of radical poverty, which was reminiscent of the recent strife regarding the spiritual Franciscans, a branch that had recently been suppressed, John attracted the anger of the Franciscan provincial, Guillaume Farinier, who ordered John arrested in 1344. In 1345, John was sent to the Dominican inquisitors in Toulouse, who found him orthodox and set him free. Farinier was furious. He had John rearrested the moment he tried to get out of Toulouse, imprisoned him again, first in Toulouse, then at a friary in Rieux, where John remained in a brick cell under a staircase until 1348, when the Black Death arrived and killed off all the friars but one, and John. He was ordered then, you think he would have survived and been set free? No, the provincial said, take him to another prison. But John convinced the friar who was taking him to the other prison to let him go instead to Avignon to plead before the Pope, which the friar let him do. So he went to Avignon, pled his case before Clement VI. And even though he called the Pope to his face the herald of the Antichrist, and upbraided the cardinals for their lifestyle, they nevertheless concluded that he was an upright cleric and a true master of Holy Scripture. They were interested enough by his prophecies that they gave him parchment and ink and books and said, write down, tell us what you're doing. He was eventually freed of heresy, but he was never actually set free. He stayed in the prison in Avignon for the rest until just before his death in 1366. I don't have time to tell you all about his prison experience, but he describes them in some gory detail. But one has to ask, how was it that he wrote 40 books while he was imprisoned? And as I'll show you, he did a lot of alchemy as well. So John wrote 2 alchemical books in the early years of imprisonment in Avignon. In 1351 or 52, he wrote the book on the quintessence, which advocates the use of alchemical techniques to extract and prepare medicinal fifth essences from various materials. He gives special attention to the distillate of wine, which we know as ethanol. John observed that while wine turns quickly into vinegar, the distillate is permanent. It does not change. He also noted that if you leave meat out on the countertop, it rots very quickly, but if you put it underneath alcohol, it's preserved indefinitely. And so he endeavored to use this preservative property that he had discovered of the distillate of wine in order to preserve the human body from corruption and from aging, and tried to make medicines from it. He found, for example, that herbs, medicinal herbs, release more potent medicine when they've been extracted with alcohol rather than with water, which of course we know now is true from organic chemistry, that these organic materials are more soluble in organic solvents than they are in water. He also advocated using alchemical processes such as distillation to separate the toxic qualities from natural products and enhance their medicinal products. Well, you know, by the way, when I was a graduate student in the 1980s, that's what we as synthetic organic chemists were trying to do, to remove toxic qualities and enhance medicinal ones. Well, for John, these better medicines would be needed to support Christians during the persecutions of the Antichrist. And John's book of the Quintessence became one of the most widely read, widely circulated, and plagiarized texts on pharmaceuticals long after 1366 came and went without an Antichrist showing up. Now, if you have ever enjoyed an after-dinner cordial based on herbs such as Benedictine, Chartreuse, an Amaro, or one of these specifically Franciscan preparations, these drinks are all the direct legacy of John of Rupescissa's ideas. They were initially produced, all of them, as medicines and tonics, and they were prepared at monasteries and friaries, which were, of course, the first dispensers of pharmaceuticals. So, if you find yourself worried about the Antichrist at some point, just have another drink after dinner, and it will all be fine. Well, John's second text, the Book of the Light of the Great Magistery, written in 1354, provides a process for preparing the philosopher's stone, the material agent of transmutation that would convert base metals into gold and silver. And John's goal here is to give the church a way to rebuild itself after the Antichrist's fall, for which gold and silver would be needed. And regardless of whether or not his process would actually work, I don't think that's an important point here. The operational laboratory principles he reveals that he was using are really remarkable, and I have time to unpack only one of them. John begins by combining 1 pound of mercury with saltpeter, salt, and vitriol, and heating the mixture to produce a snow-white sublimate. This is from my laboratory, Johns Hopkins. Yeah, I'm trying to find the Philosopher's Stone. Today, this is recognizable as the preparation of mercuric chloride. John's goal, however, is to combine what he calls the invisible sulfur or spirit of vitriol with mercury. See, up at the top, there's his interpretation. He's mixing the mercury with the vitriol. He's heating it up to get this snow-white sublimate that will be the quintessence of mercury combined with the invisible sulfur of the vitriol. Down below is how we interpret it today. And those of you who do chemistry, if you use that little triangle mark there to show heating, you're using an alchemical symbol, by the way. That's one of the few alchemical symbols that's made it into the modern chemistry. All right. But if this sulfur is invisible, how can he know that he has successfully combined it with the mercury? Well, John is just absolutely amazing in constantly wanting to have visual proofs or other kinds of proofs that his theories are actually working. And here's what he says here. The sign that the spirit of vitriol is incorporated into the sublimed mercury is that although the sublimed mercury deposits many earthly dregs in the earth, that is, leaves them at the bottom of the flask, nevertheless, if you have put in 1 pound, you will get back the same amount. Now, why is that significant? I'll tell you, I nearly was knocked off my seat when I first read this, and it set me on a research program that's been going on for 2 years to make sure that this line is actually originally a mid-14th century line, because it's almost unbelievable that it is. And I can tell you now, I found enough early manuscripts. This is John, absolutely. He's weighing his starting material and his product, and he's comparing weights. He finds them to be identical, which is a problem now because the mercury left something at the bottom, yet the sublimate weighs as much as the mercury he put in the first place. So he knows that something has been added to compensate for the weight, and that something is his spirit of vitriol, and he makes this clear. This, that is the weight being the same, would be impossible unless it is because the mercury, whiter than snow, has carried up with itself the spirit of the aforesaid vitriol, which is the invisible sulfur. This is an extraordinary statement. It completely opposes the Aristotelian ideas upon which John's contemporaneous natural philosophy depended. For Aristotle, weight is not conserved. When water boils and turns into air, it goes from a heavy element to a light element. Its weight vanishes. Shockingly, John is explicitly using the same principle and methodology here of weight balance that most histories of chemistry celebrate Lavoisier for having invented as the core of the chemical revolution in the 1760s. And here John is using this principle as a matter of course. He doesn't even bother to defend his use of it, meaning that his audience must already have known this. They would have believed this as proof, regardless of its opposition to prevailing Aristotelianism. He also describes a specially designed furnace for heating materials more efficiently. And in speaking of this new technical development, he says something really interesting. He says, "See the marvelous crafts openly revealed in this very time of present tribulation, which in other generations were unknown to the sons of men, just as they are now given to be known to the faithful poor ones," the Franciscans, "sons of the Holy Roman Church." The sense here is clearly one of progress. The sons of men know more today than their predecessors do. But this sentence contains so much more, and moves us towards answering why medieval Franciscans so pursued the study of nature. In this sentence, John extends an idea widespread among many of the Franciscans of his day who followed the eschatology of the Calabrian prophet Joachim of Fiore, that as the final days approach, human understanding will increase through divine providence. While Joachim meant understanding of Scripture, John transfers this increase of knowledge, this progressive revelation, to science and technology. His furnace technology, his transmutational process, his medicinal quintessences are all new. They are a joint product of human inquiry and divine providence. And what John does here, which is astonishing, is he has embedded a very significant line from St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians. This has never been noticed before, I will point out, because we didn't have a really good text of this part of the document. These words by Paul are originally referred to the universal extension of grace and salvation to the Gentiles, but John now uses those very same words to refer to the extension of scientific and technological knowledge in his own day. Thus, what he's implying very, very clearly by quoting Paul here is that such scientific and technological progress is part of God's plan, a continuing revelation guided by the same goodness that extended salvation to all humanity. Therefore, scientific and technological discoveries are radically sanctified as revelations of the Holy Spirit. Thus, seeking and finding them becomes not only a devotional exercise, but even obligatory for the believer. Yet there's more. I would like to argue that medieval Franciscan interest in the sciences, particularly alchemy, finds its root in three further elements of Franciscan spirituality. The material world has a special place in Franciscan theology. This is seen clearly in St. Francis's own love of the natural world as an expression of God's goodness. His Canticle of the Creatures, whose refrain, "Let praise be," in the Umbrian dialect, "Laudato si," provides the title for the recent encyclical, which deals with the care and reverence of the material world that St. Francis himself expressed. And I want to just mention something. Yes, I have a moment to do this. I noticed something recently that we have Giotto and Bellini, two very famous depictions of Il Poverello. And look at the landscape he's in. It's this very deserted, barren kind of place. Now, art historians, I've asked about this, tell me that this was intended for the original viewers to imply distance from other people, that it was out in the middle of nowhere. But of course, what did the places that St. Francis went to for his meditation and his prayers actually look like? Well, you can go there, right? Here's Mount Subasio, didn't have the building there over his hermitage, green, and La Verna, where he received the stigmata. And what I've discovered in visiting St. Francis's places of refuge is they all have the same aesthetic. They're green, they're lush, there's water, there's life everywhere. There are birds, there are animals. This is like the fullness of God's creation in one place. Very, very far from the way that we're used to seeing this. If we're not able to read this the same way the medievals were able to understand what that barrenness meant. I'll leave that up because it's really nice. And if I get boring, you can just imagine you're there. Now, although the canticle is well known, a modern reader might easily miss that the core of the text, what does it give thanks for? For each of the four material elements in turn, fire, air, earth, and water, the building blocks that form the core of the theoretical foundations of alchemy. Its verse, "Be praised, my Lord, through all your creatures," thus clearly ties study and understanding of the created world to devotion. Well, second, at the same time that Dominicans were finding the recovered works of Aristotle extremely useful for combating heresy, the Franciscans, especially under St. Bonaventure, remained wary of throwing in their lot with a pagan who held the eternity of the world and denied the immortality of the soul. Instead, they turned to St. Augustine, and through him to Neoplatonic ideas and to Plato himself, who, although still a pagan, at least argued for a creator God and the immortality of the soul. And interestingly, John of Rupescissa, he sort of disses his university education, which is what everybody does. It's just a topos. But he mentions one book that he remembers reading, which is Plato's Timaeus. Their intellectual tradition, thus more like Plato's than Aristotle's, incorporated a much higher regard for mathematics, for example, which is very evident in Bacon and in John's weighing of things, and materiality, those Platonic little triangles of the Timaeus, of substantial stuff that things are made of, rather than the Aristotelian abstractions of form and prime matter. And this view inclined Franciscans to pursue all those things about which, as Bacon said, there is nothing in the books of Aristotle. And his Scientia Experimentalis is essentially an attempt, I would say, to insert direct knowledge of things as they are in the material world into the Aristotelian syllogistic reasoning at the universities. Likewise, in so many of these authors, Paul and John, there's almost a carefree disregard for Aristotelian orthodoxy and authority. Well, thirdly, and I think most of all, I would point to Franciscan incarnational theology as an essential background to Franciscan understandings of the world and their scientific pursuits. Well, the roots of incarnational theology lie, of course, with St. Francis himself, but the idea was enunciated most famously and fully by the subtle doctor, John Duns Scotus. I think I have Scotus here. There he is, standing next to Alexander of Hales. These are put in sort of rank order. I don't know who decided what rank they were, how fast they got tenure, I don't know. What their publication record looked like, what their H index was. but they're in rank order. So just before the bishop, Scotus is at the top, and you see the text at the bottom. The subtle Dr. John Scotus, flying above all like another John. So Scotus argued that Christ's coming into the world was not primarily to redeem sinful humanity, but the apex of God's continuing, loving self-revelation to his creation. Christ would have been incarnated even if man had never sinned. This outlook valorizes the natural world in a special way. It takes us as far as possible from a negative view of the material world as something divorced from or a distraction from the spiritual. And I think we see this reflected in the repeated expressions of Franciscan joy in and at the created world. For every part of the material world holds God's presence. Every created thing is a part of God's self-revelation and is meaningful and is spiritual in that sense. Material things have a particular worth as vessels of divine self-revelation, participants in the life of God, each of which reveal facets of his being. Christ's becoming part of creation continues the self-revelation that God began with the act of creation itself, and fundamentally shifts one's valorization of the material world, making it not only worth studying, but for those devoted to finding God, imperative to study. And I think together with the Franciscan insistence on individual experience of the divine, this view naturally leads to an experiential, that is, to use another word, an experimental approach to nature, which is, of course, foundation to the scientific culture that I tried to speak about at the beginning. These influences become all the more powerful when they're combined with the Franciscan principle of univocal predication, that terms describing natural things also apply to God, not in an analogical way, as St. Thomas would say, but in a literal and a direct way. And this universal predication, therefore, makes natural objects the means to talk about, to know, to understand, to encounter God. So I think this helps us understand why there are so many Franciscans in the 13th, the 14th, the 15th century who are really deeply interested in experiment in the natural sciences, and in alchemy, and in various other fields. So in conclusion, I hope I have succeeded in giving you a brief glimpse of some of the remarkable features of medieval Franciscan science, and ways in which their theological commitments, concerns, and practices drove their inquiries. Unanalogous treatment can be done, of course, for Dominicans and others. Some of these work has been done already, so much of it for the Jesuits in particular. And finally, while I very much prefer to avoid speaking in overly broad or reductionist terms, I want to leave you and myself with something sort of to ponder over as you're wending your way home, or when a telemarketer calls that you can't hang up on, or whatever. That is this. The distinctively Franciscan concepts I just mentioned are very, very closely related to what has been cited as a distinguishing feature of Catholicism as a whole, namely sacramentality, that we heard about earlier today. In a Catholic vision, where the material world mediates the presence of God, where God works through secondary causes, where the spiritual can be made tangible, where the material substances of water, oil, bread, and wine are more than symbols, this insistence on how the material and the sensory, or the sensual, are necessary vehicles for, not distractions from, in Bonaventure's words, the itinerarium in Deum, that is, the journey into God. This vision must have played and continues to play a significant role in engagements with and attitudes towards the natural world in a scientific sense among those who are deeply influenced by or who embrace Catholic sacramentality. Now, the reason I mention this in my last seconds is that there has been no shortage for over 100 years of very, very broad claims about Protestantism and science. In the 1870s, John William Draper, the dreaded co-author of The Conflict Myth and rabid anti-Catholic, called, quote, "Protestantism is the twin sister of science." In the mid-20th century, the so-called Merton thesis, no, that's not Thomas, it's a different Merton, he was a student at Cambridge, claimed that Puritanism was the spark for modern science. And the Merton thesis was debated endlessly by historians of science from the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, the 1960s. And in this century, a colleague, and actually a friend of mine with whom I respectfully disagree, argued that the displacement of traditional Catholic biblical exegesis by Protestant biblical literalism paved the way for modern science. Well, I think we're all rather too familiar with quite different results for science that come with biblical literalism. And I've mentioned this to him, but he doesn't seem to take it seriously. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is there have not been equally high-profile claims about Catholicism in general, at least not in the history of science, not in the history of science community. And this probably has to do a lot with the basically Anglo-centric nature of the history of science as it has been for a very, very long time and is only now beginning to change. So looking towards the future, this is one avenue to be further pursued. Not that I want to increase the number of reductionistic broad statements, but perhaps some kind of pushback is not the right word, but theorization, let's say, thought about what is, in a very broad sense, in a trans-temporal sense, some of the things that connect Catholic scientists, Catholic approaches to the natural world over time. At any rate, I hope that today I've made some very small and very, very limited contribution in this regard with what I've tried to tell you about some, I think, really amazing medieval Franciscans. Thank you.
Okay, so I think we should spend a lot of time on questions, even though there are drinks awaiting us downstairs.
We can have questions with drinks, too.
Somebody, maybe you could take the other microphone. So we have two people. Any questions? Oh, Karen.
So this was awesome and fascinating and very thought-provoking. So I don't know if I missed this sort of link in your argument, but when I think about Aristotle and Aristotelianism, I mean, that's also something that is very sort of rooted in experience and observation in some sense, right? And you definitely see that in Albert and Thomas, I guess, more theoretically, but still very sort of interested in that. So this is, I mean, something that's different with the idea that you can basically distill knowledge by isolating things. That's really fascinating that the Franciscans were doing. So I was wondering if you could either repeat if I missed it or clarify a bit of how that was different. Their sort of thinking, there's not just experience through observations, but really experience when you manipulate nature in a different way that you can learn from.
Thank you very much for that. That's thoughtful. Right. So certainly we know that Aristotle was an amazing observer of nature. There's no question about this. But the medievals didn't have all of his books either, often in quite poor translations through the Arabic and Spanish, perhaps, or even Hebrew. What I think Bacon and others are trying to do is to tell us, this is going to sound slightly flippant, and I don't mean it to, I'll explain it more, is get your nose out of the books and look at the world around you. Because already by the 13th century, there were already critiques of Aristotle, many critiques of Aristotle, to disagree with him. So how do you replace what Aristotle has produced? Now, in fact, St. Albert himself did a lot of this, right? St. Albert was trying to patch the holes in Aristotle. So it's not fair to say, oh, it's the Franciscans and the Dominicans, because this is being done also, among some Dominicans, I think particularly St. Albert, his work on embryology, for example, and mineralogy. He writes his own book on alchemy as well, right? But certainly Bacon's image, there are just those kind of professors you meet that think everything is wrong about the university, and we just need a new curriculum, right? And he's doing the same thing. He's obviously not getting rid of syllogistic reasoning because he thinks that's what you have to apply to the experiences. But he's really trying to insert, and I think the other Franciscans as well, are trying to insert this experiential dimension in the middle as part of the reasoning process.
So just two questions, really. But first, that was great, and I think in some ways even earth-shattering if you know about this era. One, at the end, you didn't mention Pierre Duhem as, of course, the advocate of Catholic science. And on that line, I've always thought Theodoric of Freiburg did not make sense, as presented to me at least. He seems to be sitting there as the lone experimentalist in a tradition.
Who, I'm sorry?
Theodoric of Freiburg, who
Theodoric
explained
of Freiburg.
the rainbow.
Right.
So can you comment on Duhem, and also, did you run into Theodoric? Was he also an alchemist?
Yeah. So when I was writing this, I thought about mentioning Pierre Duhem. He certainly was, as a Francophone, as a Catholic, also a royalist, by the way, interested in promoting Catholic contributions of the Middle Ages, right? And he's had his ups and downs in the history of science, quite honestly. So he is a reckoning point, I would say, that I would still like my students to know something about Pierre Duhem. But now that the history of science has become a professionalized discipline, we can sort of take up the goals that remain from Duhem and do a better job of them, I think. Theodoric of Freiburg, what a fascinating character. Yeah, I do not know of any alchemical interests of his, but what you say about him seeming as a isolated figure is, I think, paradigmatic of how we think about the Middle Ages. So here's the image that I tell my students in my seminar in in medieval science. What we know about the Middle Ages is like an archipelago. We see bits of land sticking up above the water, but we don't know enough to know how the land is connected underneath. So everybody looks like an isolated person. And that is partially a consequence of the way medievalists of the 20th century, great medievalists, Marshall Clagett, Edward Grant, David Lindbergh, did their work. What you did, I remember the late and much lamented, Edward Grant saying to me, well, if you want to cut your chops as a medievalist, you need to go find a manuscript and do a critical edition of it. So, what we have on the shelves are all these fantastic critical editions, not necessarily translations, but critical editions in Latin. And what we're still lacking is a body of students to go through this and understand how it all fits together, to make a narrative out of it.
Thank you so much for your really amazing and inspiring talk. So I often would tell my students that that doing science I always thought of as a form of prayer. And when I looked at those paintings, it made me curious if in any of the manuscripts you read, and this is going to sound like a silly question, but did you come across any discussion of don't do this around other people? Because going out into the desert in the cave to do your explosive development of in alchemy seems like a wise thing to do.
There are certainly in the manuscripts I've seen many warnings about safety. So I just ran across one manuscript of John of Rupescissa where he's talking about doing the Mercury Experiment. And someone has written in the margin, when you do this, keep cold water in your mouth or your teeth will fall out. So yeah, they had a very keen sense of it. And John himself says, oh, here's what you do when you're testing the temperature. You stick your hand into the oven, and how long you can keep it there, but don't touch the flask because some of the materials might be on the outside and it's toxic. So they're really aware of that.
So both Franciscans and Jesuits were doing science in China. Were there any collaborative efforts between the two orders there?
I think the history of the Franciscans and the Jesuits in China is not one of harmony. um, Not that I know of. There might be, but I rather doubt it, actually.
Thank you. That was just a wonderful, wonderful talk. And as a Franciscan sister, I really learned a lot from it. And I don't think I was aware of that heritage in science that you brought forth. And I was just wondering, I guess today I don't think of that many Franciscans being in science. And I wondered if that experiential line in history that you emphasize, was it picked up by others? Like, could you see a story from them coming into contemporary science?
Yeah, here's the problem. I mean, I think most of us, when we think about Catholic orders dealing with the sciences, we think first of the Jesuits, right? Because we're living in a post-Tridentine world. We don't tend to think of the Franciscans, but there were a number of examples that are that historians of science are now beginning to pursue. For example, virtually everything we know about the original inhabitants of Mexico was preserved by Franciscans who spent the time to learn the language of the natives, to teach their children, and to record the native knowledge about herbs, about minerals, about animals, about everything else. And the reason we don't know about this, sort of unfortunate, it's a strange consequence of history, is that those reports were sent back to Spain where they were considered by the king as state secrets. And so eventually those manuscripts were sold. Many of them are in Italy now, and there were attempts to publish them in Italy in the early 17th century. These manuscripts are 16th century. And some of them have only recently, in the last 5 years, actually been published. And they contain more material about the Nahuatl language and the customs of the people than we have anywhere else. So there are examples.
Maybe a couple more questions, and then we'll go down to the cocktail party. Oh.
Would Roger Bacon have considered that there were any subjects outside the domain of Scientia Experimentalis? Or would he have said that everything, including what we would consider theology or metaphysics, to be subjects of Scientia Experimentalis?
I think what he would say, if I can channel Roger Bacon for a moment, is that even if we can't do experiments directly on theological principles, what we understand from Scientia Experimentalis from the natural world has most definitely an impact on the way we understand theology.
You were talking about this subject and sort of cast it into broader terms. You dropped in mention of White and Draper and this view of Catholicism. And this is a thing that many Catholics would benefit to know. Okay, maybe not the specifics, but but the Church's interaction with science over history, as opposed to that which is laid out in that myth. And as I've mentioned to you in an outside conversation, the Vatican Observatory, we experienced this when we launched a new web page, and we got a bunch of social media hate mail, basically. I mean, but so how do you undo what White and Wright, Draper, and them? How can you move? Can you move the needle on this and bring this into broader knowledge?
Well, let me start optimistically that the needle is moving. I see that in my field, right? Because it took so long for historians of science, this is really kind of shocking, to realize that Draper and White were making stuff up, right? When Draper says I quoted this at lunch today. Let's see if I can do it again. He says that science and Catholicism are bloodthirsty enemies to one another. Humanity cannot have both. It has to choose one or the other. And we find that repeated. I've read books from the 1950s where, for example, an eminent historian of science who was at Princeton wrote a work about, referring to the Académie Royale des Sciences in Paris, which was founded in 1666. He said, yes, well, it was founded in a Catholic country, but all the people who were important were either Protestants or they were Jansenists, so that's like Protestants. And this sort of weird idea that Catholics can't possibly contribute to the scientific revolution, for example. In fact, I was asked to write a chapter in a book called, I don't know what it was called, like 25 Myths About the History of Science. And my myth was that Catholics did not contribute to the scientific revolution, which is, absurd, yet there are so many historians of science, mostly, I might say, British ones, who maintained this. I mean, it's again this function of the Anglo-Saxon nature, Anglo-Saxon Protestant nature, in fact, that the history of science had for so long, with the exception of people like Duhem. But we don't read the French and Italian stuff, right? There is much more of it there than there is. Now, how do we address it? I think we just keep talking. And organizations like this play a crucial role. Things that the Vatican does play a crucial role. Exhibitions at museums play a crucial role. You're never going to convince everybody, because some people in a kind of tribalism are going to be against Catholicism no matter what you do, because that's part of their identity. But you reach the ones you can reach. It's like my students in organic chemistry. I've taught probably 12,000 students organic chemistry, pre-meds at Hopkins. And I know enough now that I can look out in the audience and I'm going to say, that one, that one, that one, that one, and that one, those are going to get the A+. And this one, this one, this one, that one, and that one, they're just not going to make it. And I'm sure you can do the same thing, right, with your students. You save the ones that you can. And if what you can do, those that are going to get the A+, it doesn't matter if I'm a lousy teacher, they're going to do well. The ones at the bottom, it doesn't matter if I'm the greatest teacher since St. Albert. I'm not going to help them. But there's a whole bunch in the middle that if I do a good job, I can make a difference for them. And so that is, I think, one of the ways we can deal with the issue. Reach the ones you can.
I think let's call it to a close. Let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you all.